East Africa and the Horn of Africa. And we are looking in general at the what is the impact on the region and on its on particular countries, including, of course, the question of the counterterrorism activities and the stability of individual countries. I'm joined by our great team of experts, first by Dr. Andrew Tchie, who is a senior research fellow at the Institute on African Security Affairs and who previously, of course, was in the South Sudan, where he had quite a bit of experience. Dr. Neil Melvin from the Institute, who heads our International Security Studies Department and was EU Special Representative, worked for the EU Special Representative Office in the Horn of Africa and run Horn of Africa affairs at CIPRI before joining RUSI in London, and by Martin Soyten, who runs in our office in Nairobi, who is an expert on counter-violent extremism and also does a lot of our work in the Horn of Africa from our Nairobi office. I should ask the audience around the world, those who have joined us, to put their questions and answers on the Q&A button down, as you could see in your Zoom app. And I will try to get as many of you as I can into this discussion. Let me turn, first of all, to my colleague Andrew to kick us off. Andrew, I think you need to switch on your microphone.
Can you hear me okay, Jonathan?
Very well indeed.
Brilliant. So I'd just like to start by kicking off with the 5 trends that I've been observing over the last few years in the Horn and how that interlates with where we are today. So I think the first trend, which is really important, is the decentralized and disaggregated forms of violence that have been rising. So whether it's terrorism or urban riots due to constitutional changes or general electoral disputes, we're seeing this emerge and continues to arise on the East African coast. Since the onset of the war on terror, Africa, I think, has been, in particular East Africa, has been observed a new involvement from regional and international actors who are, I would say, creating new spaces for proxy wars or the emergence of proxy organizations, partly because neighboring countries have been supporting other groups as well. The third key trend, I think, which is something that often isn't spoken about, is the focus on ongoing criminality, violence, conflict and terrorism, rather than on the prevention, mitigation and building peace through sustainable initiatives. And so you see a large focus on sort of, we have to get these groups or protest groups that may emerge as, okay, this is the way we approach it. And it's very heavy-handed. It's oftentimes using a sort of terrorist lens or terrorist approach to that. And that hasn't helped. And I think the fourth trend is really conflict management that once did exist, the local capacities of groups to come together, to talk, to have dialogue has been eroded. And most of what you're seeing now is a very militarized approach. And all of this takes place within sort of my fifth point, which is really the reoccurrence of conflicts, existing conflicts that are reoccurring that haven't really been resolved and that are emerging even into new conflicts or rehashing up old grievances. A part of this, I would say, the part of this problem is also aggravated by unequal economic growth in many parts of East Africa, the lack of democratization and weak state capacity, or the absence of governance structures, but also the weak institutional formation. So states are not really forming institutions. They oftentimes are creating shadowy kind of versions of institutions that don't actually hold the state or the necessary leaders to account. And so that causes this sort of deficit that you're seeing currently between civilians on one side, but also the state and how it operates. You're also seeing an increased population size, as I said, the economic growth, but also rapid urbanization, which is also impacting what you're seeing on the ground, and the lack of inclusion and diversity within states. So the lack of acceptance of difference, I think, is also a problem within the Horn of Africa. Now, when it comes to the state's response to COVID-19, we know there's been lockdowns, we know there's been a state of emergencies declared, but I think the state's response has been slightly different from when it comes to non-state armed groups, and that's really important to notice. While you might be seeing the lockdowns occurring, and the state using heavy-handedness, or state forces using heavy-handedness towards civilians, largely I think there has been a problem with dealing with issues of, as it were, misinformation, and that has triggered some of this, what you're seeing now on the streets, where people are not heeding to some of the messaging, or are not being able to listen to what people are actually telling them to do. And the concern here really is not just how the messaging and this information is being coordinated, but also how that plays into the role of the youth, but also people, and how they may mobilize either to support the state or to go the opposite direction. Now, this final point that I made, or the final point that I just made, is really important. Why? Because actually what you're seeing now when it comes to non-state armed groups is, I would say, three sort of trends or patterns. You have the traditional insurgency groups who generally behave and are respecting ceasefires agreement, whether they be in Sudan, in South Sudan. It's not all non-state armed groups, but some across other countries as well. But you're also seeing sort of what I would call tactical and systematic attacks by Islamic or jihadist groups like Al-Shabaab, who have really gone to the extent of really trying to tactically plan and kill certain people, or weaken the state, I would say, is a better way of putting it. So if you look at the recent killings of the Puntland governor in Somalia, that all leans towards the sort of jihadist groups and the way in which they're operating. And then the third area, which is sort of an existing issue, partly because of the weak state system that existed, but something that is combining with, I would say, the local criminality, local levels of criminality that exist. So you have this communal violence, which is now mixing with local criminality, and those two are what really concerns me now, given the COVID-19 epidemic that is going on. So what has been the regional efforts to date? So IGAD, which is the regional body that exists within there, has oftentimes been really slow to respond. However, this time we must give credit where it's due, because IGAD has actually met, its leaders met in middle of March. They convened its first meeting, discussion about what it would do, and put together some action plans. Largely speaking, they've also they've also met with health ministers from various IGAD countries, and also then follow up with the finance ministers, discussing the establishment of a substantial emergency fund. So these are all good efforts that IGAD has done. Part of that, their discussions and efforts have also meant that $100,000 has gone to each member state, as well as IGAD's Health and Social Development Division, in collaboration with IGAD's Disaster and Risk Management, coming together to form what should be a task force at some point, although that task force hasn't been set up yet. And at various different country levels, you're seeing different efforts that are taking place. And I think that's what's really been important here. Particularly when it comes to Ethiopia and Djibouti. There has been, Djibouti announced the reduction of port tariffs by 82.5% for Ethiopia. Ethiopia has been leading some of the efforts, Prime Minister Abiy, to really speak to philanthropists, particularly in China, who have been sending over equipment to various other countries. So new forms of negotiation have been taking place. Ethiopia has also been looking into getting medics life insurance. It's been preparing residents for home for workers. Kenya has converted some of its factories into production lines for masks. And these are all good, I think, good initiatives, but also good steps. I think what the concerns are is that as Africa's economy, or 90% of Africa's businesses and small to medium size, you can't sustain this lockdown forever. And so how does the state respond? How does it deal with this situation? While this COVID-19 situation has been going on, Ethiopia's Grand Dam project they've gone ahead and said actually they will fill the dam with water in the next few weeks. Again, that should be an alarm for all of us who focus on the Horn, but also we have seen in the last few weeks that Saudi Arabia has taken the side of Egypt. Ethiopia has pulled out of those talks, which the US was mediating, but also that in recent days, Egypt's foreign minister has had discussions with the Russian foreign minister. And so how does that play out? And this is a very big problem if it's not dealt with, because both countries are, I would say, willing to go to war if something isn't done or negotiated around this issue as well. And then you have the issue of tourism, particularly in Ethiopia, Kenya, Tanzania, and how that impacts not just thousands, but millions of people who work in that sector. In fact, the East African Business Council had warned that at least for this period, that $5 million of its revenue that was projected would be significantly reduced as well. So that's going to impact the livelihoods of everyday people on the ground. Then you have the issues or concern for me, which are around democratic systems, which I talked about earlier, that are not really fully established in many of these countries, but also because, largely speaking, the international system has been, or international countries like the US, France, less so France, but other countries have been very inward focused. It's also caused African countries to also look inwards to their own solutions and not actually work together. And that might be a problem going forward. The issue of refugees, IDPs, POC camps, particularly in South Sudan, where they're overcrowded, there's a lack of water sanitation, but also many people are vulnerable. You have many vulnerable groups that live in those parts. In South Sudan, as I was saying earlier, the appointment of state governors has not happened, and that's having an impact. It's also causing, I would say, communal clashes between various different groups. And that, again, is an ongoing theme that has existed. But if you combine that communal clash with the criminality, then you have a real big problem on the ground as well. So that's something that I'm worried about. And then in Sudan, you have the Sudanese pound, which is dropping again, and really only has a month's worth of foreign exchange reserve. So how will Sudan deal with this issue, particularly because it's now implemented curfews, and it's worrying because actually the last few weeks or days, you've also seen protesting against the actual state itself. So how will this all bubble up in the next few weeks? The Juba peace talks that are ongoing at the moment in Juba, which is related to Sudan and the rebel groups, and the selection of legislative members, how will that play out? Saudi Arabia more recently repatriating thousands of migrants back to Ethiopia because it said of the case of some of these, it claims Ethiopians had COVID-19. Again, how is that going to play out between those groups that are sent back? The opposition groups that are in various different countries, how is that dealt with? But I think one of the biggest things which I want to touch on is this issue of, because most of the Horn is either, most of the economies have levels of tourism that drive the economy. And I think that is a big worry, particularly for the youth, because as the levels, or as Africa, or East Africa in particular, becomes or falls into recession, you have more young people who become unemployed. And as they become unemployed, this could be used as a driving or a recruitment drive for jihadist groups as well. So the concern is, how do we deal with this as well? And sort of coming down, the sort of final few points really is about this issue of how we deal with aid. We know about do no harm and whatever that we've spoken about, or many people have spoken about over the years, but how do you distribute between international groups that are trying to deliver aid on the ground, the state that is trying to deliver aid on the ground, and sort of the private third sector that is also trying to do this. More coordination needs to be done. If not, it impacts the situation as we've seen in Kenya in the last few days. And two real, I think, warnings which I think are important and oftentimes used as quick fix. The first is that elections oftentimes are seen as solutions to long-term historical issues. And actually what we're seeing is that in this climate that we're in now, it might not actually solve some of the issues that we have in the short term. And the other thing is, while the UN Secretary General's warning of ceasefires to call for armed groups to hold to a ceasefire is an important one, in the long term, ceasefires that are not accompanied by dialogue, conflict mitigation, and peace-building efforts could increase grievances on the ground. So those are the two things that I think really we should look at. We should be looking forward, looking out for going forward as well. And back to you, Jonathan.
Thank you very much, Andrew. I should say to our audience around the world that you've been deprived from seeing me live but you've been treated instead to a very doctored photograph of me, which is much better than the original. Apologies for the slight technical glitches, but I'm probably the least important in this discussion today. Over to my colleague Neil Melvin for the broader sort of picture and setting the scene within the outside the region as well.
Thank you, Jonathan. I think as Andrew mentioned, one of the most striking developments in recent years in the Horn of Africa has been this emergence of the region as a zone for international geoeconomic and geopolitical competition. This is what I identify as the new international security politics of the Horn region, which is really manifest in the rapidly growing international interest and also presence in the region, notably the proliferation of external security actors. So today we have countries from Asia, Middle East and the Gulf, as well as the traditional security actors of the US, Europe and Russia, all active in the region. And I think, this has really had three particular impacts on the Horn region as a whole. Firstly, there's been both a securitization of the region, dealing with non-traditional security threats, piracy, peacekeeping, maritime crime and terrorism, and at the same time a militarization of the region in the form of a build-up of military forces from external actors, ostensibly to combat these non-traditional threats. And this is really manifest in the proliferation of planned and already established along the Red Sea and East Africa littoral of a whole series of military facilities and bases, stretching from Egypt's new Berenice military base on the Red Sea, which was just inaugurated in January, all the way down to Turkey's largest military base outside Turkey, located in Mogadishu in Somalia. And there's also been a buildup of naval forces in multilateral naval missions and naval military exercises across the Red Sea, Gulf of Aden, through to the Gulf of Oman. Secondly, we've seen the linking of land and maritime security. They become interconnected. The traditional African security focus has been really a continental land-based one. Now we see a strong focus on the maritime dimension. And this is because the focus of the external security actors is not just the countries of the Horn. It's also their maritime domain and the littoral areas. And in particular, access to the Red Sea has been significant, which is why we see a buildup of naval forces in the area. Thirdly, we've got the appearance of mixed commercial and military facilities on these coastal areas, especially by China and Middle East countries. They've sought to co-locate their military facilities with new commercial ports and larger infrastructure. So what has been behind the drivers of this new development? Well, firstly, it has been the growth, the enormous growth of the East-West trade routes. China and its rise, the rise of Asia on the whole, as major economic powers, means that the global, one of the major sort of global trade arteries, center of globalization, runs through the region in terms of access to the Red Sea, the Suez Canal, and then the markets of Europe and North America. So protection of sea lines of communication, so-called SLOCs, has been at the center of one of the of many of the countries' interest in the region, and in particular the access to the Bab el-Mandeb Strait, the very narrow entranceway to the Red Sea, where billions of dollars of trade pass each year, perhaps more than 10% of global trade, and daily almost 5 billion barrels of crude oil and petroleum products go through that strait. And for some actors, this is particularly important. For example, China, 40% of its foreign trade passes through the Red Sea. Secondly, has been the rise of Africa, and I mean that primarily as an economic issue. African economic potential is seen as an area where countries want to invest, which is why we've seen a lot of resources going into new infrastructure, ports and railways, but also seeking access to Africa's resources located in its hinterlands, which requires this new infrastructure. And thirdly, we've got these new security actors becoming involved in the softer security, in part to burnish their image as responsible international actors, and to protect their emerging interests. So these issues I mentioned before, peacekeeping, particularly around South Sudan, are not by coincidence a major sort of supplier of oil to China and others. The anti-piracy mission has been one focused, of course, on making sure these sea lines of communication stay open. China has led on the evacuation of its civilians at the early stages of the Yemen war. We've also got military training. This, I think, reflects the new security identities of these emerging security actors, which they are playing out in the Horn of Africa. Fourth has been the relative decline of the US and behind the US, Europe in the region. We see that in the response to the Somalia piracy issue in 2008, when the United States called for multilateral response. So it invited that many of the new actors into the region, which of course we saw China coming there with its first overseas naval operation. The US under Obama stayed out of a direct role in the Yemen war and instead looked to the Gulf countries to deal with that issue. And the US has made public statements about pulling back both from Africa and the Middle East, which has opened up a space for others to come in. So the US is seen as ceding its monopoly on regional security and on maritime security, which is, of course, a monopoly that was originally established by the British in the 19th century and then subsequently passed to the US in the post-World War II period. That monopoly is in danger of passing to a multitude of other actors. So what does the ground, what does it look on the ground? And I think we can really see three main clusters of external security actors which make up this new international security politics of the region. Firstly, we have the Asian countries led by China, which is there because of its economic interest, the Belt and Road Initiative, building infrastructure from South China Seas through to the Med and beyond. But also, Horn of Africa marks a point along the so-called string of pearls, China's construction of mixed commercial military facilities, again from South China Seas through the Indian Ocean. And Djibouti has become the home for China's first ever overseas military base, despite for many years saying they wouldn't build such an overseas facility. And the Chinese don't call it a military base, they call it a strong point or logistics facility. Nonetheless, Djibouti has now emerged as a military base, primarily as an anti-piracy operation, but expanding in a sort of mission creep way now to doing peace ops, evacuation of civilians, naval and military diplomacy, intelligence gathering. And this is likely to become the first of a network of Chinese military facilities across the Indian Ocean, including for power projection. But also we have Japan and South Korea present, following similar economic agendas to China, but also shadowing China's growing military role in the Indian Ocean. And India too has come in to the Horn region, really, I think, responding to China's rise, and has access now to France's military base in Djibouti and the US facilities across the Indian Ocean due to logistics agreements. Secondly, we've got the Gulf and Middle East countries. There's been a dramatic shift in which they become major actors, driven by, firstly, the economic opportunities, the desire to diversify their economies as the end of oil sort of comes in sight, but also aiming to piggyback on Chinese BRI projects. Secondly, it's been about blocking Iran's efforts over the last decade to open up a Western flank on the Gulf countries by going into the Red Sea with its naval forces, establishing access agreements to Horn ports. Saudi and UAE in particular have sought to push back on this. Thirdly has been the Yemen war, in which, in order to engage in combat in the Yemen war, UAE and Saudi have looked to establish military facilities in the Horn. They've also brought soldiers from African countries, particularly Sudan, to fight in the conflict. And lastly, I think, has been this sort of intra-Middle East struggles, which have now begun to be exported into the Horn. 2017, when Saudi and UAE broke with Qatar. That rivalry has played out particularly in Somalia. We've got a second struggle, which is really against Muslim Brotherhood, in which UAE and Egypt are seeking to block Turkey's role in the region. And now that's being linked into the conflict in Libya, in which UAE is using its military base in Eritrea to supply its proxy forces in Libya, where they're often fighting against Turkey's proxy forces. And to consolidate this, Saudi Arabia has in recent months set up its own regional security framework for the Red Sea. And lastly, we have the traditional powers who've really been caught out by this sudden change. They've missed out on the infrastructure, the geo-economic boom in the region, and they're now playing catch up, but really I think are unsure where to go. The US has indicated that it, at least when we had John Bolton as National Security Secretary, that China and Russia would be its targets in Africa. John Bolton is now gone. We don't really have a clear strategy. And the European Union also has yet to formulate how to respond to this. So how does COVID affect all of this situation? Well, I think that, these are long-term and deep-seated shifts in the international security system, the international economics. So the major trends, I think, are unlikely to be fundamentally altered. What we're likely to see is an acceleration of some trends and a possible slowing down of others. And I think we can identify some sort of issues there. There may be a slowdown because of the economic crisis that's unfolding. The Gulf countries in particular may be hard hit by this. Other sort of middle powers like Russia and Turkey also may face severe economic problems after the pandemic, which may limit their abilities to achieve their ambitions in the Horn. There are also tensions around the new interdependencies manifest in the crisis. Saudi Arabia recently has been sending back Ethiopian migrant workers, unsure whether they have COVID virus or not and how they'll be dealt with in Ethiopia. That's caused some frictions. There's been some mistreatment of African students in China around the COVID virus and the suspicions amongst the Chinese population and very rough treatment, which African Union has pushed back against. Saudi looks to be trying to find an exit strategy from the Yemen war and is trying to leverage the COVID crisis as a way to bring this to an end. But I think we could also see, two areas of possible acceleration, and I'll conclude with these 2 points. Firstly, we're only at the beginning of the COVID crisis in Africa. How this is managed and how it plays out in the Horn of Africa is going to be key, and in particular, how these international security actors seek to offer assistance or help countries manage this crisis. Who is going to come to their aid? Will it be China? Will it be the US, the traditional actor? And what will that mean about the long-term sort of engagement of external actors in the region? And lastly, I think it's clear that we're going to see increased US-China competition coming out of the pandemic, not because of the Horn of Africa, but because of wider tensions. But that will play into this region because what we've seen overall, and I think reflecting my comments, is the Horn of Africa is now part of other global security systems. It's part of the Middle East and Gulf security region. It's also part of the Indo-Pacific. And so its own security now is going to be linked to those issues in that area. With this, back to you, Jonathan.
Thank you very much. Thank you, Neil. Thank you for raising some global issues and their interaction with the region. And now we are sort of zooming in again, as it were, to the region and to Martin, who I think will be talking to us about the situation in the area in which he is now, especially about the impact of on radicalization trends in the region. Martin, over to you.
Thank you so much, Jonathan, and also thank you, Andrew and Neil, for your remarks and comments. I think indeed, as you're saying, I'm going to zoom in a lot more and be a little bit more specific. My focus is on Kenya and Somalia, so that's what I'll focus on. What I will touch upon a little bit without being a health expert, I think it's worthwhile. I'm not sure that all of our listeners are following the situation as closely as we are, but just to talk quickly about COVID itself and the spread, and then talk about the responses, because I think that is indeed the important part, and then look a little bit ahead into the future. So in terms of the spread of COVID in Somalia, it was a little bit slow, but unfortunately a couple of days ago, the curve have started looking a little bit more exponential. I've heard that it has spread into the communities, which of course is a great concern. All of you know that Somalia does not have capacity to manage significant challenges, and the health system is poor. In the urban areas, there's very little opportunities to ensure social distancing. Many people are living without access to clean water, leave alone sanitizers, masks, gloves, things like that. So the fear is, of course, that once the virus is there and spreading into the community, it could go very fast. We've not seen that until now, but the last couple of days are not looking too positive. In Kenya, on the other hand, the government responded very quickly and set up a task force and has been able to, by enforcing a curfew and now also a movement between the cities are not possible. And thankfully, the numbers are not increasing as fast as they have in Europe and other places. I just saw the latest figures as of a few hours ago. There was 234 infections and 11 people have died. Unfortunately, we have a number of recoveries as well, which is great. Now, of course, many people are speculating as to whether these numbers are accurate because we are still at the managing of the spread stage. We are not, and that means that the government are testing at the initial stages still. However, as the government has been saying, we've not seen lots of people coming into the hospital. So either people are sick and not going to the hospital, or maybe indeed, hopefully, it hasn't spread as much. So that's of course, what we are hoping. What I think is really important to look at is the response to these to the situation, and in particular when we relate it to the risk of increased violence that both Andrew and Neil talked about, and more specifically perhaps violent extremism and international violent extremist groups taking advantage of the increased vulnerabilities. I think it's really important to look at some of the dynamics that violent extremists always use in their recruitment narrative, or at least often have done here in the Horn. One thing is the response by law enforcement. The first thing to say about that is perhaps when the government of Kenya started its curfew, there was some elements of violence, in particular around critical infrastructure. I'm actually in Mombasa right now, and those of you who know the area, there's a ferry that connects Mombasa to the mainland, and ensuring social distancing on that ferry is incredibly difficult. And lots of workers who are living day to day, they come into Mombasa Island for their work, and ensuring social distancing on that ferry. The officers that was in place on that day, unfortunately, they were using a little bit of excessive force. We've seen other incidents of the same, for example, ensuring some measures in public transport, and also just in general trying to make sure that people live up to social distancing. However, I do think that the cry, if you want, from the population was heard, and the message had gone to the security system to try and support and advise people rather than being too forceful, because everybody is acutely aware of the risk of doing so. The other thing that is really important to look at is, of course, the population that is most at risk of recruitment and radicalization, being either to political violence or violent extremist groups, or indeed, normal crime. And that's the young people. And as my colleagues have mentioned, and as we all know, we have a large population of young people who live in urban marginalized areas. And they are both, they're living day to day, and therefore their livelihood are perhaps most at risk as the economy is really slowing down. They also have the least opportunities to ensure social distancing because they live in very overcrowded areas. Again, they might not have access to clean water, soap, sanitizers, and so on. So not only are they perhaps at greater risk of getting the virus, they're certainly also at greater risk of the negative sides of the response that is there. Interesting enough, the government in their approach decided to kind of reach out to the youth in a different way that at least I've seen in the Kenyan communication strategy, and reached out to the youth as a friend or as a colleague who can help sharing accurate information about hand washing and all of these measures. And the minister directly kind of appealed to the youth in trying to get their support in doing that. So that's, it's a different way of communicating the youth as responsible individuals, a part of this society, as opposed to troublemakers. So I saw that as a positive. Now, the whole question when it comes to Al-Shabaab is, of course, even if we in some have an increased vulnerability towards recruitment and radicalization, are they actually able to take advantage of that situation? And I would say we haven't seen a significant change in the levels of violence in the Kenya border areas. There's always, or not always, but there's significant number of attacks and incidents, and they have been similar over this period as they have in the past. And as well in South Central Somalia, it's looking pretty consistent. I'm sure many of you have seen that Al-Qaeda and ISIS have made statements around coronavirus, mostly relating to telling their fighters to look after themselves, but also kind of communicating that this is sent by God and this is time for non-Muslims to learn about Islam and consider converting. But overall speaking, I don't see Al-Shabaab as having the capacity right now to be able to take advantage of this situation, thankfully. And then as I move towards looking a little bit ahead, the main thing is, of course, it's to look at what is coming in the future. And Ramadan is a couple of weeks away. And we know that during Ramadan, normally there's excessive use of violence. It's a time that violent extremist groups, Al-Shabaab in particular, tends to take advantage of. So they might do that as well this time. So that will, of course, be a great concern. But so looking at the future, what we really need to consider is how these measures and the responses are impacting people of the Horn, how the economy will be impacted, and of course, how the health systems will be impacted for a long time to come. One of the positive things, I suppose, that is worth mentioning is that in Kenya and Somalia, there's a relatively high level of penetration of mobile phones and mobile technology. And that means that most of them have access to mobile money. So should a very severe crisis occur, it's actually possible to reach most people through mobile phone and do like cash infusion. So this gives us a little bit of opportunity in a very severe situation. Another thing that could happen as a consequence of the situation is perhaps the relationship between Kenya and Somalia. It has been strained by the maritime situation, but this COVID situation, they may have to find ways of working together, in particular if the spread is very severe in Somalia and Kenya is managing to overcome a little bit better. And then just as I head back over to you, Jonathan, I think there's a bigger picture question maybe sitting in Africa that resonates with me, or that has made me think differently about things. It's this whole thing about, perception. When you deal with violent extremism, understanding perceptions of the world is really important. And I think COVID-19, it has come from, in this case, from the most of the incidents in Kenya has come from people who travel through America, through Europe, through UAE. And it used to be that dangerous and difficult diseases to manage came from the global south, came from Kenya, came from Africa, came from Southeast Asia, but kind of now it's the other way around. So this idea that dangers always come from the south, this has kind of turned that around. And who has been able to manage the situation best? At least for now, it seems like Kenya has been able to thankfully handle it more positively, partly because, of course, they had the advantage of time. But I do think that the situation is changing a little bit our understanding of the dynamics and the relationships across the world. Yeah, thank you, Jonathan. Over to you, Jonathan.
Thank you, Martine. And unsurprisingly, the questions are coming through thick and fast. I think the first question is actually to you, Martine, just a point of clarification. We asked by Catarina Santos, how accurate are all these figures that are being bandied about infection rates and indeed mortality rates?
Defection rates, as in defection rates in Somalia, I'm involved in managing one of the defector centers in Mogadishu, and we have indeed seen an increased number of defectors, but they are not, as of now, they are not super significant. These things tend to come in waves. So I think it's too soon to conclude something massively because of Corona. We need a little bit more time.
Okay, and I think I will try to combine two questions on the same topic and put it to the panelists. The first one is from Harold Walker, Ambassador Harold Walker, a veteran diplomat, who's asking about the broader Chinese objectives in the Horn of Africa and how they're likely to be impacted by this current crisis. And the more specific one is from Vincenzo Caporini, who's asking us the frankly racist excesses that have taken place in China against African citizens of various countries. How would that have an impact on China's footprint in Asia now that these reprehensible pictures are flashed all around the world? Neil, would you like to start?
Thank you, Jonathan. Yeah, I mean, I think it's a very good question about China because it's not an easy issue. I think what we've seen is an evolution in Chinese engagement. And also, I think a growing realization that China isn't necessarily a unified actor in Africa, although there are, of course, strategic dimensions to it. Now, I think what we see in a sort of initial phase of Chinese involvement has been a strong focus on the economy, on sort of what China sees as the opportunities of Africa in terms of investment, but also in terms of providing loans to build things, which has of course played into China's need to export some of its surplus domestic capacity for these issues, which was framed, I think, in this win-win sort of paradigm initially. In the second phase, of course, what we began to see is actually the impact of that economic activity, which was not always as well received and sort of as effective as China had wanted. The issue of the enormous debts that have been building up around some of these projects has I think, come into focus in many countries. The corruption often that has underpinned some of these projects, and also a question about whether they really are in the interests of African countries. And I mean, referring to the second question, I know in Kenya there's been also very controversial developments sometimes in which Chinese workers have been found to be being very racist, treating their workers very badly. And then, for example, on the SGR railway, there have been very few Kenyans actually even employed in that. And I think in 2018, China even had to replace its ambassador in Kenya and bring in a whole new team because the PR was so bad. So China's been, I think, trying to respond to this, and on things like the debt, it has been incrementally sort of shifting the goalposts a bit. Most notably, we see that around the railway that's been built between Djibouti and Ethiopia, in which they've extended the debt repayment. And that, I think, shows that to some degree that there's been Chinese state firms often who've been operating outside the framework of China's strategic goals. That they've got loans from banks in China, and then they're sort of acting almost unilaterally in there, and China central governments had to pull them back. On the security side, Djibouti is significant. It's the first ever, as I mentioned in my talk, overseas Chinese military base, but it's not a war-fighting base. I mean, it's far from China. It doesn't have the facilities to actually be a major challenge to, say, the United States in the region, or even some of the other regional actors. But what it will be significant in is that it's going to link in to a wider network. And this is an incremental buildup of Chinese military forces in the Indian Ocean, step by step. And the anti-piracy mission in the Gulf of Aden and the Djibouti base have been a way of learning about the Indian Ocean, about training up forces to operate there. They've had non-stop missions, I think over 30 by now, to the Gulf of Aden since 2008. And so this is going to, I think, preparing the way down the road for Djibouti to become part of that wider network. So it's less significant for the Horn of Africa and more significant, I think, for the wider region. Back to you, Jonathan.
Excellent. I don't know, Andrew, if you want to come back on this one.
On the second part, which is really, I think, about whether or not what will be the impact. And I don't think there's a significant one. I know that certain countries have taken some measures. Ambassadors have contacted their various Chinese counterparts to have conversations about this. But I think in the long term, I think this will be something that fizzles out. It'd be something that will be remembered, but I don't think it's something that really will be systematic. I know Uganda has decided to deport a few people. I'm not sure what the sort of strategy is around there. But I don't think African leaders will just sort of turn their backs on China and say, actually, the way we want things to be done is going to be different. I think what is different, what is key here for me is actually the way in which Africans approach this, because they can pull in various different sources of revenue. So whether it is going to the EU for one source, or China, or multiple different actors. And I think that really is where the space is for me, and what is key for the future, as opposed to whether or not its relation with China will change, because I don't see that changing in the future.
Excellent, thank you. I think the next question is probably to Martine, but again, other people can answer, which is from Adam Cass, who is asking, what is the impact of this health crisis on AMISOM, on the mission in Somalia?
Yeah, I think, thank you for that question. I think it's a really important one. It's not something I've seen something written about. So it's, I'm going to speculate a little bit that all of the contributing countries who are contributing with forces, they are going to be working really hard to try and make sure that it's not spreading into the forces. I know in Mogadishu, they're doing all they can, because that would, of course, be very severe. So, yeah, I think the answer is that everybody will be doing what they can, because, yeah, if it spreads, it will be difficult. I don't think it will slow down anything. I assume if someone gets ill, there will be replacement. So I doubt that it will affect very much, but I'm sure everybody's very concerned.
Okay, let us turn, unsurprisingly, perhaps, with quite a number of questions about the geopolitics of it. So I think I'll put that to Neil in the first instance. We have an anonymous question about the competition between Gulf states and places like Turkey, for instance, for influence in the Horn of Africa and access to the Bab el-Mandeb. And I think that we also have a question about from Christopher Warnock about Djibouti and the Chinese there, namely the very prominent Chinese military presence there, whether there is any likelihood that this would be affected by the health crisis. Neil?
Yep, thank you, Jonathan. Yes, I think this, thank you very much for the question on the Gulf, because I think there's been a lot of attention to this issue, and it has been quite a big shift. What we've seen, of course, is initially a sort of welcoming of the Gulf role, and it has I think we should acknowledge it has made an important contribution. There's been a lot of financial assistance, which has often been crucial for some of the countries in the region. For example, when the new prime minister in Ethiopia came to power, there was a large sort of financial crisis, and the Gulf countries helped bail out Ethiopia and keep it going. The Saudis also played some sort of role in the Eritrea-Ethiopia reconciliation. There has been this important contribution, but on the whole, I think what we've seen is the Gulf and it is exporting of its own kind of internal factionalism into the region has helped destabilize some countries, and Somalia in particular has suffered from this, in which we've seen particularly the UAE and the Qatar in competition, with Qatar sort of lining up behind the federal authorities and the United Arab Emirates looking more towards the federal regions of Somalia, including some of the breakaway ones, and actually committing to build a brand new port in Somaliland, and initially even linking that to a military base, although they've subsequently pulled back from that. I think an interesting case now is Sudan, in which there was a lot of concern that the Gulf countries were going to help sort of undermine the democratic transition there initially by swinging behind the military. I think it does highlight a new kind of relationship between the Gulf and, well, the UK in particular. I think the UK has played a major role in sort of diplomatically working with the Gulf countries to actually help support the transition. So this, I think, shows a new kind of relationship there. I think my last point is really on Turkey, which is Turkey has made a big commitment to the region, and you know, it's played an important role in training military forces in the Somali National Army. It's investing a lot in the Mogadishu port. It's looking for other economic opportunities. It may be suffering from a degree of overstretch, and also now that there does seem to be this active coalition led by Saudi and Egypt to try to block the Muslim Brotherhood sort of influences which they feel Turkey is leading on. And this, I think, is a large part of what's behind the Saudi new regional security framework, which is set up in January, and also involves military exercises, so-called Red Wave military exercises in the Red Sea. So blocking Turkey and blocking Iran are key parts of that. And we may find that Turkey is going to be struggling to maintain its influence in the face of that sort of united front. Back to you, Jonathan.
Thank you. Let me try to bring in a few development questions, a few economic questions. We've got an anonymous question and a number of anonymous questions, and an additional one from Elizabeth Cargill, all asking about what measures could be implemented in order to provide debt relief, grants, in order to address the pandemic's economic impact. And of course, where are the financial institutions, the global financial institutions, when it comes to that? What do we believe is likely to be achieved? Connected to that, we also have a question from Madeleine Moon, a parliamentarian in the UK, who's asking, what is the Commonwealth of any help at all? After all, a number of the countries that we talked about are also members of the Commonwealth. Andrew, I wonder if I could start with you, and perhaps we'll pass afterwards to Martin as well for a few comments.
Sure, and I think there are several things that can be done. I'm not an economist, but I'll try and focus on what can be done regionally, but also some of what I think are solutions that will support. I think what needs to happen really is the re-engagement of the regional economic communities, in this case, IGAD, and the mechanisms that are put in place in coordination with the African Union CDCP. And that needs to happen really because that helps them regionally be able to share information, resources, capabilities, coordinate strategies, but also to really bring in some of the expert scientists with a detailed plan about how they're going to respond. And that has been lacking. I think there's also a need for the African Union, in this case, the regional, the main body in Africa, the African Union CDCP and IGAD, with the support of UN, to actually help think about assembling African-led, but also global pandemic health and security experts who can really come together and talk about what rapid response plans should be put in place to help support the things that are going on. But I think a wider point, which I think is really important to not just dealing with this pandemic, is really about the way in which the global situation has occurred, in the sense of, you know, the way Trump's behaving. This is not something new. Some people are saying it's new, but we had this same situation during the Iraq War, where Kofi Annan, the then Secretary General, gave a warning about the world being at a fork. And I think that's important, because actually I think what is going to be required now is leadership from Africa, particularly because it has dealt with pandemics before, not just the Ebola crisis and other pandemics that are across the continent, but also because it needs to really look to itself for the leadership. And I think that's going to be key going forward. Particularly important is to take the African people on a journey and really to bring Africans on a journey that really encapsulates their hearts and minds, or hearts and mind campaigns, people like to say, but a way of unifying and bringing people together through dialogue and conversation about what is next. And I think that's going to be key. If not, I think you could see that the ramifications of this pandemic really taking control of what's going on the continent, or in this case in East Africa. I think that we need to look more towards the African Continental Free Trade Area Agreement. That would boost intercontinental trade, and that is needed. African countries are going to have to look ahead, recognizing and factoring in things like supply chains, securing seaports, land transportation, and cargoes ahead of the time. And there has been some movement. Ethiopia has had an agreement with the UN. Rwanda now is saying that they're going to start flying its cargo flights again. And these are good developments, and steps in those directions are needed. But also, I think one of the things that we need to look at is remittance. Remittance in 2008 was something around the region of 46 billion. And I think we need to look at how we can do cash transfers, but also how people from the diaspora, like myself from here, can be able to give money back, because there are a lot of causes on the ground, a lot of things that we can be doing. But I think opening up those markets to enable that to happen is going to be crucial. But also, I think one of the largest things which is really, really going to help solve this issue is going to be looking at local grassroots initiatives, local innovative initiatives that are taking place on the ground that help solve some of the issues that we're seeing, particularly because, as I said earlier, 90% of African businesses, small to medium-sized businesses, 90% of African businesses are small to medium-sized. And so, in essence, you need to think about these local mechanisms to help support and push people forward.
Thank you. Neil?
Yes, thanks, Jonathan. No, I think it's, following on from Andrew, I think we have an opportunity in the international community to respond to this crisis in Africa in a multilateral way. And we've seen that, I think, the last few days with the G20 agreeing to freeze debt, at least until the end of the year, which is an important signal. I think the danger is, of course, that we may see exactly the same dynamics as we've seen around the early stages of the pandemic, in which there's been a lot of sort of competition amongst countries to show who's best in providing medical assistance, who's got the best model for managing the crisis, sort of who started it. Now, what we're going to see if that happens, of course, is that some of the tendencies I spoke about will be magnified in Africa. And this is going to both harm, I think, the stability of the countries, but also, risk the undermining the efforts that are being made on the pandemic. China, of course, is going to likely emerge from the pandemic sort of lockdown first. China has a sort of a domination of the medical supply chains. And so, of course, it could play that card. It could play the card of being the good international Samaritan, providing masks and equipment to African countries, but sort of tied to what we've seen in other countries, where it's really done that in a propagandistic way rather than in a sort of humanitarian way, which has got other countries very nervous. So, I think this is the moment when, on the European side in particular, we need to look about how to try and take some leadership in the absence of US leadership on the multilateral response. President Macron in France, I think, has made some gestures towards this, and there's been a letter I saw from some other European countries co-signed by African countries about this. So I think, the UK maybe should also start to look at whether it can make a contribution here.
Thank you. And Martin?
Yeah, I think I wanted to say that I think there's something to be done right now as the humanitarian crisis kind of evolve. And here we have, unfortunately, a lot of experience already to build off. As I was mentioning before, the mobile cash transfer system has been used many times. And unfortunately, the most severely affected population has been affected by lots of other things throughout the year, the low-cost droughts. Unfortunately, it's the same people who will be most affected by this. So there's a humanitarian immediate response that needs to come into play, and I'm sure it is quite quickly. The second one is the development issues. Like, for example, we are seeing excessive use of, excessive domestic violence, some of those more development issues where women who are living together with abusers need different support. So the development actors will be challenged by, the operation environment to be able to provide the support that people so desperately need. And then two things that my colleagues haven't touched so much upon. I think there's also a massive amount of local support that has already happened. there's constant conversations about giving here. Everybody who has a little bit more will be giving everybody around them as much as they can. So there's certainly also kind of a domestic help going on. And then I think to build both Kenya and Somalia up again, or like to kind of burst the economies as we get past this, is really to provide support by the huge number of small and medium businesses. They are suffering right now, and they will be the ones who help the countries in the region through. So the main challenge will be, how do we shift from a humanitarian to a development situation, and how are the development actors able to engage within kind of the situation that we're seeing now, where you can't meet people as easily, you can't have the same kind of conversations and so on. Yeah, thank you, Jonathan.
Well, I'm afraid we've reached the end of this webinar today. I must apologize to a number of our colleagues and our audience whose questions I couldn't put, especially I think to Jordan Sarabji, who asked, I think, a very compelling question as to what's the exit strategy from this health emergency for all the countries. Dare I say, the kind of question the entire world is grappling with, not only the countries of the Horn of Africa. I hope that you've enjoyed this discussion. I invite you all to join us every Thursday during this crisis for a continuation of this analysis. But meanwhile, my gratitude to Andrew in the UK, to Neil somewhere else in Europe, and to Martine in Nairobi for joining us for this discussion. Thank you all, and thanks the audience.